please can we welcome to the Bavard stage our final Bavada of the night, Alan Jackson, telling us about the Prince and the Junkers.
Good evening, everybody, and I am very definitely happy and in this moment. And thank you very much again for the opportunity to talk to you all. I've got a great story for you this evening, a true story based in the summer of 1942, and it involves an individual act of heroism by a particular individual in that aeroplane. That's a Supermarine Spitfire, and this is one of 3 Spitfire stories that I've created, and I look forward to delivering this one to you first. First of all, I just feel that I must introduce 3 men without whom the Spitfire would not exist. That is R.J. Mitchell. R.J. Mitchell designed the Supermarine Spitfire from scratch in the early 1930s. Some 6 years earlier, he also designed that aircraft, the Supermarine S2B, which some of you might recognise as being the Schneider Trophy winner for Great Britain in 1929, 30 and 31. Mitchell had that aircraft in mind when he went forward to develop the Spitfire. This is Geoffrey Quill. Geoffrey Quill was a test pilot on the Spitfire program. It was his job to test all the initial prototypes and experimental versions. He was the bridge between the draftsman's board and the reality of a logistical flying aircraft that actually worked. Finally, some 23,000 Spitfires were made since before, during and after the Second World War. Each one of them had to be tested before it went to the squadrons after it left the manufacturing centre. And that meant that a total of 37,000 test flights were made across all the Spitfires ever produced. This man and his team ran all those test flights. And it's said that Alex Henshaw personally flew 10% of those. There is no man, and there is never going to be any man who spent more hours in a Spitfire cockpit than Alex Henshaw. So I think it's fair to say that without these 3 men, the Spitfire would not have entered the Second World War and wouldn't have entered aviation history as a truly iconic aircraft that it is. The first Spitfire prototype flew in the spring of 1936. It's a long story as to why the first production aircraft didn't come out for another 26 months. But notice the similarity between the production Spitfire and R.J. Mitchell's earlier dream, that won the Schneider Trophy, as cutting edge as it was inspired. Now, funnily enough, the chairman of Supermarine at the time was a chap called Robert McLean, and he had a 6-year-old daughter who he fondly referred to as his little Spitfire. Thus, the aircraft got its name. And apparently R.J. Mitchell wasn't all that impressed. It's just a sort of bloody silly name they would choose. And interestingly, I only read a few months ago that actually R.J. Mitchell wanted to call it the Shrew. Not sure if it has the same punch, but who am I to say? Anyway, that is a Supermarine Spitfire. Cost then about £12,500. Cost now equivalent £650,000. The first squadron of Spitfires was delivered to number 19 Squadron in Duxford by Geoffrey Quill, one by one. That squadron was previously flying that aeroplane. That's a Gloucester Gauntlet, the top of the range at its time, and pilots were very proud to fly that into battle. But can you imagine what it was like when Geoffrey Quill flew the first one of these babies into Duxford? Oi, oi. All of a sudden we've got an enclosed cockpit. We've got undercarriage that disappears up inside the wings and all the other stuff. And I think in that photograph you can see the step change that military aviation made in this country, from which point nothing would ever be the same again. Now, male pilots and women pilots of the Air Transport Auxiliary that did a lot of the deliveries of these Spitfires all said the same sorts of things: a hell of a rate of turn, a hell of a rate of climb, and a hell of a speed across the ground. And also, it almost felt as if all they had to do was think about what they wanted the aircraft to do, and it would do that. For me, the thing that sticks in my mind the most is that after the war, a German Luftwaffe pilot who flew Me-109s was quoted as saying that if he and his squadron were bounced upon by a squadron of Hurricanes, that was going to be another day in the office. But if he was bounced upon by a squadron of Spitfires, he never quite knew if he was going to get home safely. So let's get back to the Spitfire Chronicles, the Prince and the Junkers. Now, my story starts in in the summer of 1942. But I do want to give you some historic context. So what we've had the Battle of Britain, spring 1940 until the end of the summer 1940. The Battle of Britain nearly brought us to our knees, but not quite, and we just about won it on a wing and a prayer. The Blitz then started when Hitler got so irritated by the fact that we hadn't bowed down earlier that he blitzed every major city in the southern half of England, and that was known as Blitzkrieg, or the Blitz as we now call it. That started in September of 1940 and finished in the spring of 41. Now, at the end of the Blitz, Hitler was pretty convinced that he'd done all he needed to do, brought us to our knees, he'd come back and finish us off later. The itch he couldn't scratch was the invasion of Soviet Russia, which he cracked on with after the Blitz. Now, here's the thing. What he didn't realise was that the number of civilian casualties that were sacrificed in the Blitz were horrendous. But as far as the RAF was concerned, runways, aircraft and other assets were largely untouched. So I'd ask you just to remember that as I go forward. So anyway, on we go to the German invasion of Soviet Russia, started in June 1941, and Hitler thought that would be over by Christmas 1941, 6 months. As it happened, it took another 3 years. And at the end of that 3.5 years, 3 million military German personnel lost their lives. Another 9 million on the Russian side lost their lives, and another 18 million civilians on the Russian side lost their lives. That's a total of 30 million lives lost because one man thought he would invade another country. Does this ring any bells with you? That's how irony works. Anyway, back to my point. So what we have is a situation where the German military forces are committed like crazy to the Russian conflict. 3 out of every 4 Luftwaffe aircraft were committed to Russia. If you add that to the fact that the RAF were not bombed out during the Blitz, then we've got headlines like this one. RAF again swarms over West Germany, almost with impunity, notably the horrendous bombing of places like Dresden, Cologne, etc., etc. And all the time, Nazi Germany didn't really have too much to push back with. And so Hitler demanded that the Luftwaffe come up with a solution. That solution was known as Hohenkampfkommando. How could we put the pressure up on the undefeated British while we sort out all these problems that we've got in Soviet Russia? Hohenkampfkommando. What that means is high-level combat command. It consisted just of 2 aircraft, 2 Junkers, 86 aircraft, adapted for high altitude. Each one had one great big bugger-off bomb, about 550 pounds, which at that time was huge. And it's the earliest example that I can see of a stealth bomber. Because the thing of it is, when one of these came over, it was roughly at 43, maybe 44,000 feet, a good 14,000 feet higher than your standard commercial 747, something like that, V high. And as each singleton aircraft came over, British radar would pick them up, but figure they're just coming over to take photographs, not worth the psychological and economic impact of sounding an air raid siren in a place like London or Southampton or wherever it happened to be. So they were left to come over with pretty much impunity. And this was working for a little while because the Germans realised they weren't being shot down because they were far too high. Never had anything that could get anywhere near that height. And so it was kind of working-ish. You know, some targets were hit, some targets weren't, until one day. Not long after breakfast time, Bristol city centre, the 28th of August, 1942, a Junkers 86 climbed over the southern coast of the United Kingdom and dropped a 550-pound bomb over Bristol. Now, just outside a row of shops in a department store in Bristol, where was it? Oh yeah, Broadweir, there were 3 motor cars. The middle one was a Ford Model 10, funnily enough. The bomb that the Junkers dropped hit that Model 10 smack on and burst the fuel tank of that car, plus the 2 cars either side, and sprayed 2 adjacent crammed double-decker buses with flaming petrol. The scenes of carnage are impossible to describe. It was horrendous. And it was unexpected. That was the, if you like, beauty of this strategy that the Germans had come up with. But 48 people died that day, 56 were critically injured, and a response was demanded by the Royal Air Force. That was August 1942. The following month, the RAF Special Service flight was announced. Special Service is suitably ambiguous for a reason. Actually, the Special Service flight was put together with maybe three or four Spitfires, specifically to sort this problem of the high-flying Junkers out. So the Special Service flight came into being. It was the latest Spitfire Mark 9, actually, with the upgraded Merlin 61. It was made very, very light, and it was armed with just 2 cannon. So it didn't have any machine guns on either wing, just 2 cannon that fired explosive shots. And funnily enough, each one was Cambridge blue, which is that colour, which I think is more of a green really, but anyway, in the sky, that just makes you a little bit more invisible. The climb rate was incredible. That climb rate of 20,000 to 43,000 feet, that's 23,000 feet in 6 minutes, which is the equivalent of about 44 miles an hour straight up. 2.5 times faster than any other previous Spitfire, and that's why the weight gains. Pilots were trained on how to breathe pure oxygen and what to do when the oxygen ran out or there was an interruption. And many pilots remembered one thing that was the best advice they ever got from their trainers at the Royal Air Force establishment in Farnborough, where a lot of research was done. And they were told to keep calm, keep icy calm. Think carefully before you do anything, and everything will be okay. Special training and the diet. I love the diet. Bacon and eggs plus chocolate for the trip. That was it. How much scientific work went into the nutritional value of that for somebody flying at 43,000 feet? I'm not sure. But anyway, I'd have been reasonably happy with that if that had been me. And a heating flying suit, which is not a surprise. And so the Special Service Unit was put to readiness, waiting for its first scramble. They didn't have to wait very long, because on Saturday the 12th of September 1942, 2 German pilots boarded a Junkers 86. The pilot was the highly decorated Erich Sommer, highly decorated because of his experience and his ability to fly bombers accurately and on target. And he was accompanied by Horst Goetz on the right here, a highly gifted navigator and bomb aimer. And it was the 2 of them that went into the cockpit that day. They flew from Beauvais, which was in occupied France, where their base was, and they were picked up by British radar as they flew over Fécamp on the northwestern coast of France. It was believed that they were probably heading either for Southampton or for Cardiff. They weren't sure at the time. But what they did do was they vectored they scrambled a Spitfire and gave him vectoring details so that he could be intercepted. That was that man in that aircraft there, BF 273. Just before 9:30, this man took off. For now, that's all right. Sorry, I wondered what that was. I haven't got sound on it. So it was this man in the cockpit at that time. Now, for now, we'll call him Manny. More on him later. So Manny took off from RAF Northolt, was given the trigonometrics in order to intercept this Junkers 86 with Sommer and Goetz on board. Now, they met over the Solent and Manny engaged the Junkers 86. The pilots of the Junkers 86, 2 things happened then. The pilots of the Junkers 86 realised this was no longer a bombing mission, this was a survival mission. So they dropped their bomb over the Solent and figured out the best way to return the hell home. The first thing that Manny did was eject his auxiliary fuel tanks, because he wasn't going to need them anymore. They were empty by now anyway. We're going to make the aircraft lighter, and away we go. And he engaged the Junkers 86. This is where Manny's problems started, actually. He'd already planned that he was going to come in high, above, and to the stern of the Junkers 86, which was completely unarmed, and fire at will as soon as he got to that point. The problem was, at these heights, the technology for making sure that your equipment didn't freeze wasn't fully perfected, and that included guns. And what happened was that his port gun failed. That's a plan of Spitfire. It's got 2 guns on each, just so forgive that diagram. But what happens if the port gun doesn't fire? Well, then the whole aircraft just twists to the right. Because of the ricochet, you can imagine, if you've got something happening with all that thrust, you're going to yaw to the right-hand side in this case. Now, that yaw meant that Manny went into a flat spin. As he did so, he went through the contrail of the Junkers 86, and just to add to his problems, his cockpit visor froze up completely. Manny went into a flat spin and lost 2 things. 1, his consciousness, and 2, 10,000 feet. By the time he'd got to 30-odd thousand feet, he'd recovered himself. He would have banged his head on the cockpit several times. And when he did that, he realised that he needed to reacquire. So he put the throttle to her and went back up to 43,000 feet and reacquired the Junkers 86 for a second time. That second time, exactly the same thing happened. The port gun failed, he yawed, went through the contrail and span and lost 10,000 feet and consciousness as well. For the 3rd time, that happened. For the 4th time, that happened. So after the 4th time, he's at just about 30,000 feet. He looks at his fuel gauge and realises he's got enough fuel for another attempt. Who the hell is this guy, Manny? I'll tell you who he is. Emmanuel Galitzine. Or, to put it most appropriately, Flying Officer Emmanuel Galitzine, previously known as Prince Emmanuel Galitzine. His great-grandfather was the Emperor Paul I of Russia, whose own mother was Catherine the Great. Now, he was born in 1918. In 1919, when he was 1 year old, his parents took him and fled from what was then monarchist Russia. They were monarchists. They fled Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution and went to London to settle down. As soon as Emmanuel Galitzine got to appropriate age, he joined the Finnish Air Force straight away, which at that time were at war with Russia to fight the evil communists, as he saw it, that forced his mum and his dad out of Russia. Then, sadly, a year or so before our events here, he learnt the unfortunate news that his mother had died in the Blitz. So he returned to the UK, joined the RAF, and signed up and became a flying officer. This is one highly motivated individual, and it was him who was in BF 273 that day. So where are we? We've attempted 4 times. He attempted a 5th time, and guess what? Exactly the same thing happened. Exactly the same thing happened. He reacquired, but then he realised, as the Junkers did, that he was starting to run out of fuel. By the time this whole scrap had finished, they were both over Salisbury, and that's when the Junkers decided to try to return to the nearest available occupied airport, which was Caen. Galitzine gave chase until he got halfway across the channel, realised he was running out of fuel as well, so he headed for his nearest RAF base, which was Tangmere on the south coast. He's the blue line, and here is the Junkers line. Now they would have, pilots in both craft would have been pretty naffed off about all of this. Galitzine naffed off that he hadn't brought this aircraft down, and the 2 pilots of the Junkers failed in their mission to drop this bomb effectively over a proper target. But here's the thing. When that Junkers landed and was inspected, it turns out that on one of those 5 attempts, Galitzine had got one cannon shot that went straight through from the trailing edge of the port wing and out through the leading edge. That wasn't enough, anywhere near enough to bring the aircraft down, but it was enough to demonstrate to the Luftwaffe that their whole Hohenkampf commando strategy was not going to work, because now the British had pilots and aircraft that could travel that high. And so it was that it was closed down within days of Galitzine's trip. So I think it's fair to say that this man, aged 24, was responsible for seeing the death of a complete bombing strategy. God only knows how many lives, particularly in the southern half of UK, that man saved by getting one cannon shot round through that port wing. Where are they all now? Well, Eric Sommer had a good war. He survived. And after the war, he retired and moved to Australia and wrote 2 books. One of them was called Luftwaffe Eagle. And he died in 2005. Goetz. What about Horst Goetz, the navigator? Well, that's a picture of Horst Goetz when he was 62 years old. This is a picture of Emmanuel Galitzine then and more recently. And the 2 of them met together, having already established a friendship, in a hotel in London in 1975. And this is a clip from the, the Daily Express. And I love this bit up here in the Oval. 33 years ago, they duelled in the sky. Now they toast the gun that failed. Now, going back to Goetz, bless him, he died in 1980 at the age of 67. Our hero, Emmanuel Galitzine, flying officer Emmanuel Galitzine, is having his story told tonight. He died in 2002. He actually forged quite an illustrious career as a pilot for British European Airways. Do you remember them? BEA? Based in Northolt, used to fly Viscounts and other bits and bobs. He then joined Hawker Siddeley and sold twin prop aircraft around the world. He's very, very effective salesman indeed. What of BF-273? Well, BF-273, after a couple of weeks after he landed, was repainted in standard fighter command colours, but was shot down along with its pilot about a year or so later. And that, my friends, is the story of the Prince and the Junkers. But, as usual, just before I go, I'd like the Spitfire itself to say hello and goodbye to you tonight.
Thank you.
He's rolling now.
He's rolling.
You tell me when to start. Speaking.
Okay. Do it.
Speaking?
Yep.
On the 5th of March 1936, the Spitfire prototype K5054 made its first ever flight from the Supermarine Works at Eastleigh in southern England, heralding the start of a legend that is just as powerful today as it was during those dark years of World War II. Fuck me! Fuck me! Fuck me!
Thank you very much indeed.
Anyway, wasn't that fantastic? Alan Jackson.
Thank you very much.